Chris Jingchao Ma currently works as a visiting assistant teaching professor in the Augustine and Culture Seminar program at Villanova University. She holds a PhD in philosophy from Villanova University, and her work engages with feminist philosophy and focuses on queer and trans theory and transnational feminist debates. Her dissertation was entitled Narcissistic Gender, Social Formation of the Gendered Body, and she is presented and published on queer theory and transnational feminism. Today, she's going to give a talk entitled The Habit of Sensing, the Social Context of Gendered Bodily Sensations, and I'd like to ask all of you to help me welcome Professor Ma.
Thank you, Ed. Thank you so much. Thank you for inviting me to be here, and then thank you all for showing up and joining us. This is an incredible opportunity for me, so I'm really excited. And thank you for remembering the title of the talk. It's not on this paper, so yeah, you nailed it. So this is part of my dissertation research, and I'm taking this part out and try to formulate it into its own argument here. But so I'll talk a little bit about the larger project by the end as well. Okay, so I'll just start the good old-fashioned reading a paper out loud. In his 2021 April interview with Vanity Fair, actor-activist Elliot Page, who had just come out as trans, shared his joy and relief after transitioning and after coming out. He said, "The most significant difference is that I'm really able to just exist. I would imagine you understand where I'm coming from. Just exist by myself, like be able to sit with myself, not have some constant distraction, all these things that aren't conscious or aren't even overly overt. For the first time in, I don't even know for how long, I'm really just being able to sit by myself. I think of all the energy and time that was going towards feeling uncomfortable, constantly checking my body, just feeling unwell. And I've got a new ability to explore creatively and write, and just how much I'm reading. That's been really amazing," end quote. In addition to admiring his courage to share his journey, I can't help but notice that Page's account of gender dysphoria, like that of many other first-person accounts of gender dysphoria, centers the constant uneasiness of the body. Gender dysphoria is viscerally felt. It is, quote, constant distraction. It demands one's energy to, quote, constantly check one's body, and it is a feeling of being uncomfortable, unwell. So if you're familiar with the mainstream feminist glossary, you might know that contemporary feminist theorists make a distinction between sex and gender. The commonly accepted distinction goes like this. Sex is the biological feature that is male and female, and gender refers to the social roles of men and women. And feminism challenges gender stereotypes, and trans people are people whose psychological gender don't match their biological sex. And I say that with a quotation mark. However, this distinction is unstable. It does not reflect how we understand these terms in everyday use. It does not fully express trans people's bodily feelings of unease. For many trans people, it is not that the masculine or feminine social role that is incongruent and unlivable, but it's the dysphoria that is bodily and visceral. So how do we give an account to bodily gender dysphoria that acknowledges reality, that it is not just in someone's head? What does the experience of gender dysphoria mean for the binary norms that we have of human bodies? What does it mean that this body doesn't feel right? In this talk, I develop a phenomenological account that reorients how we understand bodily sensations. Instead of focusing on the sensation, I turn to the unnoticeable background against which these sensations stand out. We often assume that there's nothing more private and natural than bodily sensations, and I challenge the naturalness of bodily sensations and argue that bodily sensations are socially contextualized. Thus, the question, how can this given and natural body feel not right for trans people, is turned into what context must be there for this cisgender body to feel natural and right? How does the cisgender experience of bodily sensations come to be the norms? The naturalness of cisgender bodies is not the natural result of bodily biology, but a privileged pattern of sensing among many other possibilities of gendered bodies. So that is the overall argument, and now the first section, gender and sensations, or how to breathe underwater. Many theorists have discussed how we perceive the sex and the gender identity of other people by looking at them. How we glance into a room and look at the pedestrians in the street and we see men and women. Others have discussed how medicine and our everyday categorization variously base the sex of people on their anatomy, the genitals, and the overall body shape. Is there more to the bodily sex than what meets the eye? For the sake of discussion in this essay, I use perception to mean our sensory perception of the external world, including other people, through vision, sound, smell, etc. And I use sensations, especially bodily sensations, to mean the feelings within the organism that is our individual body, such as pain, itch, swelling, etc. So it's an ad hoc distinction that I'm using for the sake of argument in this paper. So sometimes the word interoception will also be used for bodily sensations, as it means perceptions of things within the body. So the question here is that many people have talked about how gender identity is a matter of perception, how we see other people and categorize them in gender categories, how we have assumptions and sometimes gender stereotypes about them. But sensations, which we take as essential for our self-knowledge of identity, lack a critical dimension and cannot be easily theorized. So I ask, what kind of bodily sensations mark gender? Is it the feelings produced by our bodily organs, or is it embodied emotional feelings? What is the sexual difference demonstrated on the body that we can feel? How can we think about the bodily sex that doesn't focus on the anatomy or the genitals? Feminist philosopher Elizabeth Gross offers a way to think about gender binary not as the dimorphism of genitals, but as two different cultural models of body fluids. As we live in our society, there is no escape from how our society understands and shapes our bodies. We cannot experience our body completely raw without using any language or concepts that we learn from other people in our society. The Western culture, Gross argues, constitutes women's and men's bodies as two different types in terms of how body fluids work. It is not to say that women and men produce different body fluids. After all, many are the same: tears, sweat, saliva, etc. What Gross means is that Western culture has constituted the male body as one that gives fluids and must not receive body fluids of other people, while the female body are constituted as the proper receiver of body fluids. This constitution works in such a way that if a body with a penis receives the body fluids of others, it will be seen as a feminized body and not fully masculine anymore. In our cultural representation, men's bodies are solid, quote, sealed up, impermeable, end quote. And the proper sexual action for men is to give body fluids and never receive it. While women's bodies are seen as receiving, but also leaky, soft, ever demanding, insatiable, absorbing without a certain shape. There exists a fear in the Western culture of women's bodies and the porous contamination that they represent. The way we speak of the movement of body fluids reflect how our culture constitutes men and women in this economy of desire. In that way, we cannot simply talk about body fluids, or even we cannot experience them without such dichotomies as giving versus receiving, active versus passive, reserving versus overflowing, etc. So Gross carefully parses out the phallicization of the male body. It is the body's experience of secreting fluid, but it is the phallic logic of the dominant culture that makes it the essential male experience. In this way, Gross shows how a certain cultural connotation of the bodily experience is naturalized, made gender-specific, and inseparable from the body experience itself. Since the cultural sexual difference is tightly knit with our own body experience, and we experience our bodies in these cultural terms, Gross then goes on and declares that transgender experience is impossible. She contends that, and this is her language, so I'm just going to put everything in quotation marks. She contends that the transsexuals who have a male body can at best revile its masculinity and live a fantasy of femininity. The body is not open to all the whims, wishes, and hopes of the subject, Gross argues. For example, and this is her example, a human body cannot breathe underwater. For her, to be born with a body that is phallicized, that is, a body that has a penis and then the penis is given a cultural connotation, is an inescapable situation. And to be constituted by the society as impermeable, solid, the proper giver and never receiver, and aggressive is irreversible. Thus, one's sexual body in our society can only be denied in bad faith. That is, you deny it, but you don't really believe that. Gross argues that the social connotation and the position in the gender binary is tied to this anatomic structure and assigned to this person. The subject constituted in its society cannot stand above and beyond the social gender ideology where it is made. Therefore, for Gross, being transgender could only mean psychologically ignoring this given body, given both in flesh and in words, and denying a fact that one also knows to be true at the same time. Gross concludes that, quote, the one sex, whether male or female or some other term, can only experience, live according to the cultural significations of this sexually specific body, end quote. So in this claim, we see that male and female experiences are taken as two given categories, as the sexually specific body is taken to be given and homogeneous, which means in Gross' argument, male bodily experience are all the same, female bodily experience are all the same. We cannot escape such cultural categories of prescribed bodily sensations as they constitute the society where we're made. Insisting otherwise would just be denying fact. Bodily sensations are seen as the internal experience that is constituted by the societal ideology. So Gross suggests that a man cannot experience bodily sensations that are constituted in our society, can only experience bodily sensations that in our society are deemed as phallic and masculine. That is, only cisgender experience is possible and legitimate in a society that is dominantly cisgender. It is important to point out that whether the morphology or the sensations that Gross refers to must still be understood as not simply biological or natural, she does shift the emphasis away from anatomy or genitals toward bodily sensations and cultural imaginations of the human bodies lived in this particular society. But not only her rejection of trans people's first-person experience, which is a lot in the book, but also her understanding of the male and female bodies needs to be examined, which is the academic way of saying is problematic, needs to be examined. The problem here is that male and female bodies seem to be taken for granted. While many theorists have convincingly shown how the taxonomy of human bodies into two sexes is more an effect of the ideology than a biological truth in the body itself, we might be tempted to say that, well, penis and vagina are quite obvious and cannot be denied. But penis and vagina only stand as a shorthand for the sexual dimorphism that we socially recognize. As Talia May Becher argues, genitalia stand in the imagined position of authoritative indicators of gender. But our daily interaction with other people rarely require any proof of their genitalia. We address someone as ma'am almost certainly without seeing their genitals, but based on a series of other indicators such as their style of outfit, their makeup, their hair length, etc. Furthermore, many gendered biological traits are matter of grades and not kinds, and are matter of gender policing. For example, some cisgender women have a mustache that they might shave, and some cisgender men have a higher pitched voice of which they are ashamed. Precisely because these disturb our imagined clear demarcation of the biological differences between the sexes. These examples show that our society's understanding of sexual difference is not just simply penis or vagina. The genitals only stand as a natural justification for all the things that we do see and or enforce. So the male and female bodies should not simply be taken for granted as the unquestionable starting point of theorization. Furthermore, Gross contends that a male body can only have culturally legible male bodily sensations of solidity and impermeability, the female body that of fluidity and receptivity. For many trans people, their experience is precisely that the bodily sensations seems to be obtrusive, out of place, and calling for attention, as the beginning quote of Elliot Page reminds us. For many trans people, the body does not present an unquestionable biological truth, which they then deny or ignore or live in fantasy, as Gross says. But their bodies present a contradiction or a dissonance that is at times unlivable. In important ways, many trans people report their experience of gender dysphoria as being visceral and embodied. In a recent qualitative research, Pulis, Farrell, and others interview some trans people about their experience of gender dysphoria. And I quote, and these are firsthand accounts that they cited in their research. So the first one, a white non-binary person, 20-year-old. I'm mostly uncomfortable with my chest and voice. They feel inherently wrong and embarrassing, as if it's something to hide, something that shouldn't be there. And I bind to avoid my chest, way longer than suggested, but deformed ribs are a con I'm taking, and try to speak as little as possible. An Ashkenazi man, 19-year-old, said, often I get sensory issues surrounding body parts. For example, hyperfixate on the feeling of having breasts, not necessarily the gendered connotation, and end up having trouble breathing or focusing. And this is a Jewish male adjacent person, 33-year-old. Showering and dressing are particularly difficult. I understand that this is my body, but I can't relate to it due to a conflict between what I expect to be there, a male body, and what I see there. When I shower and dress, I've got to look at and touch and thereby feel parts of my body that shouldn't be there. This creates a literally nauseating dissonance that kind of throws me out of my own head. I'm shocked by what's happening. Pulis Farrell and others particularly point out that these dysphoric sensations do not necessarily mean that these people are comparing themselves to binary gender ideals. Note that one reports that his disturbing hyperfixation on the feelings of having breasts does not necessarily have to do with their gender connotation. It's just their physical sensations of being there. The authors also know that many people's report of their gender dysphoria is not detesting the body of a binary sex and wanting the body of the other binary sex, but attribute their dysphoria to not having the desired balance between masculinity or femininity, or wishing to de-emphasize gender in general. So contrary to what Gross might say, we see these accounts are not necessarily people comparing themselves with an imagined bodily ideal and therefore having a fantasy about what their body can be. They're also not denying a simply male or female body and attempting to live in their fantasy of the other. They're reporting on how their bodies feel and the reality of what their bodies are right now. In other words, it is not that trans people feel these bodily masculine or feminine sensations and wish their body to be otherwise. Body dysphoria means that the anatomic body does not feel masculine or feminine in the way that cisgender bodies do. So the next section is titled Complicating Sensations, or How to Feel Your Heartbeat. So how does the same organ afford different sensations? What conditions our bodily sensations? What are the mechanisms that make some sensations perceptible, some sensations meaningful, and some jarring? In Theorizing Transgender Identity for Clinical Practice, S.J. Langer shows us how we must reorient bodily sensations to think about not the sensations themselves, but the background against which they appear and become perceived, the background that makes some sensations perceptible or imperceptible to us. Langer first introduces the free energy principle from neuroscience as a new way to understand perception. If anyone here is a neuroscientist, you know this so much better than I do, and please educate me during the Q&A. But I think this works for this argument, and this is the little bit of free energy principle that I get. So bear with me. So the old way of understanding perception in philosophy is to treat the mind as the interpreter of sensory input. Sensory input, for example, sight, comes first and temporally prior to and as a condition of cognition. The input is then interpreted by the mind, or for example, the sight is what I see is a water bottle in front of me. So contrary to this input interpretation model, contemporary neuroscience has a different model for how the brain works in perception. Neuroscientists now believe that in order to save energy, the brain constantly makes predictions ahead of time, and sensory perceptions provides feedback on these predictions rather than raw materials. Most often, the brain does not need to change the prediction because most things in our daily life are relatively predictable. So instead of the input interpretation model, our perception more functions on a prediction, check, adjustment model. So for example, the floor is still where it was the last time I felt my feet on it. The temperature in the room remains the same, and the table that supports my arms does not disappear suddenly. When I walk in the park, my brain predicts trees, sky, bird, songs. From time to time, the brain modifies the prediction when the feedback is different. For example, when the table starts to wobble due to years of heavy burden of philosophizing, or when the temperature suddenly drops because the AC is broken. So when the brain's top-down activation of prediction does not match the bottom-up activation of an interoceptive or exteroceptive, so internal perception or external perception stimulus, that is, a surprise arises and creates free energy. The task of the organism is to reduce free energy by changing the prediction patterns of the brain to match the new knowledge. So, for example, now I indeed expect the table to wobble. So interoception, or as I call it, bodily sensations in this essay, function in the same way. The brain makes predictions about what internal sensations will likely occur and make adjustments to these predictions based on sensory feedback. Langer shows that insofar as gender identity has some subjective or internal certainty to it, it can be understood as a type of interoception. For example, my feeling of I am a woman is confirmed by my bodily sensations. I'm a woman, therefore my brain predicts not feeling a penis next to my thighs and feeling proportionally wider hips with greater joint mobility and so on and so forth. Something that Langer points out that cisgender people rarely actually feel precisely because it almost always meets with the prediction. Curiously, Langer does not explain how the brain associates womanhood with the lack of a penis, a topic that I'll take up in the next section. So, as an exception to the prediction, check, and adjustment model, there are some predictions that do not adjust whatever sensory feedback they get. So for Langer, gender is such a constant that doesn't change. He calls it a hyperprior. And he explains it's a kind of prior that are possibly genetically coded and cannot be resolved through homeostatic or allostatic capabilities of the body except in rare cases. It's a feature of our brain that cannot be altered according to the sensory perception feedback. Langer explains that even in the most severe brain damage, after losing most cognition and memory, people do not forget or mistake their gender identity. Therefore, one's gender must be fundamental and not subject to perception, cognition, or memory. For people whose gender hyperprior is different from their bodily sensations, the sensory stimuli from the body will often do not match these predictions. So, for example, one may have the brain prediction of a woman's body, yet feels a penis next to the thighs. So the difference between trans people and cis people then is not that trans people feel something but constantly deny it in their head, while cis people feel something and then follow them correctly to the conclusion of their gender. On the contrary, since our bodily feelings are set in a background of gendered sensations that cannot change based on the sensory feedback, trans people's bodily sensations incongruent to such background constantly produce free energy that causes mental stress, while cisgender people's bodily feelings do not contradict their hyperprior gender predicted in the brain. Langer claims this ease leads to cisgender people's gender feeling being less acute or even unnoticeable. Quote, humans do not generally perceive their heartbeats, the same way cis people do not feel their gender. This can be understood through predictive coding. When a stimulus is predicted, there's no need to update priors to match the incoming stimulus, end quote. So cisgender people do not feel their gender, not because they cannot, but because their brains are predicting it in such a way that such a feelings do not arise as noticeable. In the same way that if we pay attention to our breathing or our heartbeat, we can notice it. We can actually notice the feeling of air passing through the nostrils. But most often we don't. Since it is such a predictable background of our experience that we don't need to feel them. So they don't constitute a constant challenge to the brain's prediction. For trans people, Langer claims the body feelings they perceive do not match the brain gender that predicts the incoming flux of perception. thus creating dissonances all the time, like someone who always feel their heartbeats. Trans people always feel these gendered sensations that misalign. These sensory feedbacks are constantly going against the brain's prediction. So in this way, Langer turns the subjective experience of the physical body from a capacity to do to a possibility to feel. So remember the Elizabeth Gross comment, a body cannot breathe underwater. Langer says it's not a non-negotiable limit of capacity. It is a possibility that emerges or not against a background of habitual familiarity. Is a person with certain organs capable of performing tasks for which they do not have the corresponding organs? Am I able to fly with my wings, which I don't? Perhaps not. But is a person with certain organs capable of feeling its movements or sensations, or of ignoring the feelings when it is frequent, expected, and predictable? Certainly yes. The sensory background changes how we understand the possibility of bodily sensations. So since brain gender cannot be altered or adjusted based on sensory feedback, one way that trans people may manage their excessive free energy is altering the objects. That is, to take steps, medical, prosthetic, aesthetic, etc., to address the body so that it gives feedback that better matches the brain's gendered prediction. How am I doing on time? Okay, so let me get to the habit part. Yeah. So let me skip a little examples. But this actually the example of shaving legs, which is the poster. But you get the point. If our bodily sensations become perceivable because they stand out from a familiar background, this background seems to be twofold. For each individual, the background conditions their perception of every object. Yet each individual's background is also inseparable from a social background. Our brain provides a background against which the sensations appear as normal, pathological, unexpected, or do not appear at all. But it is also the effects of norms, practices, and social habits that are much broader than the individual. To say that each individual has their background doesn't mean that the background belongs entirely to the individual. Part of our background is a shared social one. We share languages and cultural symbols that shape our world. So the notion of hyperprior does not fully capture the fact that gender is not only an individual identification, but an individual identification according to shared social norms. One feature may be genetically coded, but as we can see, one's gender identity is so much more complicated than one biological feature. So gender is neither genetically coded nor never changing. It is historically and socially defined, regulated, and enforced. Bodily sensations depend on their meanings within a social milieu. So we need a more social and interpersonal account of bodily sensations for our understanding of the gendered body. And for that, I turn to phenomenology for the concept of habit. So the next section, habit of sensing, or how to make gender disappear. So I turn to the phenomenological concept of habits to discuss this disappearance of predictable sensations, or more precisely, how they become predictable and expected, how we learn to direct our attentions, and how gender binary disappears as the background in which cisgenders embodied experience is taken for granted. French philosopher Maurice Merleau-Ponty offers a way to think of our body and habits in a body that moves about, performs tasks, organizes the world, and lives in its daily environment. This is not a solipsistic body or a purely scientific body that remains the same biological organism in isolation, but a body that brings together its lived environment and its history. Because the body lives in its environment, its habits form according to the environment. For example, we form the habits of sitting down at a desk, taking a stroll around our neighborhood, eating with forks and knives, or hands, or chopsticks. Habits are always a joint effort of our choosing and repetition, the environment's affordances, and the body's somewhat reluctant malleability. Merleau-Ponty says, habit has its abode neither in thought nor in the objective body, the body as a scientific object, but in the body as mediator of a world. The body's habit brings together its spatial and temporal aspect, its environment and its own sedimented history, and carries them with the everyday style of the body. Another important feature of habit is that to form a habit means that the effort of doing certain things disappear, at least from our notice. A task that we do repeatedly may become habitual, and the way it organizes our body becomes habitual. So Merleau-Ponty discusses habits not only as a repetition, but also as habituation, something we grow used to. So one example is if we think of typing, it's a very commonly used example. We form a habit when we learn the movement, learn typing. Not only do we do the task, but we understand it and we familiarize ourselves with the task so that the body extends its capacity to type, for example. We don't just press one key after another. Rather, we learn typing, which means that we incorporate a certain style of pressing keys on the keyboard as part of our ways of expressing ourselves. When we form the habit of typing, we do not, after the habit is formed, we do not aim our fingers at the keys anymore. The keys stop being the objects of our attention. Rather, we aim at typing the next sentence and expressing ourselves through our fingers and the keyboard. So to form a habit is to, what Merleau-Ponty calls, to take up residence in things to which we are habituated. And the ability to form habits show the power we have of dilating our being in the world. Another Merleau-Ponty beautiful quote. Forming habits means gaining a capacity, a routine, or a new way of moving our body through the world. But it also means losing something. We lose the feeling of effort. We may not stop putting in an effort for the task, but we stop feeling it as an effort. The effort of putting the finger at the correct key, the effort of holding the phone, or the effort of looking for the key, right? These all disappear from our consciousness as we now just naturally type on the phone. We familiarize ourselves and habituate ourselves to these tasks. Okay. So with a rich phenomenological understanding of habits, we can now look at Langer's arguments about gendered bodily sensations again. I suggest that we can understand gendered bodily sensations through the framework of habits. We tend to think of bodily sensations as unmistakable, but habits actually shows us how gestures, behaviors, actions, and skills can be habituated and naturalized in our bodies. So gender identity and its embodied experience can be understood in this way, that it is experienced as a set of routinized and expected bodily sensations, or the lack of bodily sensations. The hetero-cisgender binary offers two types of normative body maps, or more precisely, not maps, topography of sensitivity. We grow to be accustomed to them to various extents. To be of a certain gender in our society is to form a certain habit of bodily sensations. What to feel, what not to feel, what parts should have heightened sensations, what parts should cause shame because of their sensations are inappropriate, etc. This notion of habit denaturalizes and contextualizes our bodily sensations and opens the space to discuss how social norms influence our bodily sensations and sensitivities. So let me explain with a personal example. Like many cisgender women, I started shaving the underarm hair in early puberty. There was no real biological need for shaving the underarm hair. The hair itself is rather soft, not causing any irritation. The need for shaving is completely social. In the beauty standard that sometimes blends into the hygiene standard, underarm hair on feminine bodies is seen as inappropriate. As a visible sign of sexual maturity, paradoxically, our society requires that adult women remove it, since our society has a paradoxical standard for women's sexuality to be visible and invisible at the same time. So I keep a better regimen of shaving in the summer than in the winter. Most of my upper body is under sweaters and shirts in the winter, and the social need for a hairless underarm does not exist, except when it does. So I take weekly dance lessons where I usually wear a sleeveless outfit for movement of arms and shoulders. In the winter months, when I don't feel any underarm hair and therefore constantly forget to shave it, every week I feel them when I dance. At the beginning of the class when we stretch, as I move my arms around, I'm reminded that I forgot to shave, not only by seeing myself in the mirror, but also by the lack of the sensation of the bare skin touching other parts of the skin or touching the fabric. Oh shoot, I forgot to shave again. Oh shoot, everybody in the class can see, I say to myself. So what is this sensation of the bare skin? The sensation that you feel right after a shave and disappear after a while because you expect it. The society expects it. Other people looking at a feminine body expect it. What is it about the dance class that I suddenly notice the lack of the bare skin sensations? The sensation at the area of skin at the underarm area that is suddenly heightened to remind me that it is not a perfectly feminine bare skin that I'm showing. Underarm is marked as different from other parts of the body, that a woman, not a man, is supposed to manage their hair growth there and maintain the illusion of the skin being complete, because even a rash is unacceptable, right? You have to pretend that the skin does not grow hair at all. So the sensations of the bare skin, touching the bare skin or touching the fabric of her clothes is something that needs to be so routinized that she doesn't feel it anymore. To form the habit of shaving is to habituate to the sensations of the bare skin, and noticing that you have hair will make the movement of your arm just a little awkward, restrained, and hesitant. So with the formation of the habit of shaving in puberty, my feminine body schema directs my attention to my underarm and builds a layer of shame and sensitivity. I should be embarrassed for exposing them with hair to the extent that I should avoid raising my arm. The sensations are not primarily a result of my skin having nerve endings. After all, other parts of my skin also have nerve endings and feel touch of fabric should I pay attention to it. Furthermore, underarm hair is mostly policed for women in our society, and men in our society do not feel such hindrance of raising their arms. So their attention is not directed to that area. The shyness to show unshaved underarm has nothing to do with the nature of the arm, but is the feminine body schema, partially composed of the morality of covering and exposure of feminine sexuality in our society. In the dance class scenarios, it also originates from a gaze from others. Although other dancers probably couldn't care less about my body hair, what I perceive is an imagined gaze of other people enforcing the moral code of the feminine body. You should be shaving because people will see what they know to exist but must not see. So the body hair, the bare skin, and the sensations, the specific way in which they're sensitive has to do with the gendered morality of presenting the body. We not only get habituated to certain bodily sensations, but also cultivate habits of sensing. Habits of paying attention would lead to heightened sensitivity and thus to different habits of sensing and the gendered morality of covering, revealing, shame, embarrassment, sensitivity, etc. Point to such a habituation of our bodies and habituate our attentions to different body parts. Such cultivation happens in a social milieu where different parts of the human body is given different cultural, sexual, moral meanings, and in this case, a gender binary. Norms of gender binary offer us a topography of our bodies about what kind of body should have what kind of sensations at exactly where. People habituate their bodies more or less according to these norms. They are habituated to feel their genitals, body shapes, motricity, and comportment according to these binary terms. These sensations then do not appear as odd or as unexpected. So this framework puts cisgender identities in question. Instead of thinking of cisgender as on the right or normal side, I argue we should think of gendered bodies as bodies that form various gendered habits and are habituated to various sensations, environments, and behaviors. The bodily sensations that feel right to cisgender people are not more natural, more correct, or more necessary than the bodily sensations that feel wrong. The gender identity that we identify with, or not for that matter, means a certain set of habits of sensations and relations to ourselves and others. In this sense, becoming a gender also happens on the body after the body is born. In our society, we're encouraged to develop according to one of the two styles of comportment, motricity, and body techniques, like shaving. We are also encouraged to develop according to one of the two topographies of sensitivity, two maps of shame and morality, two sets of appropriate and inappropriate sensitivities. So finally, to denaturalize the cisgender body doesn't mean that all gendered bodies are therefore all made up or illegitimate. Habits are malleable, but deeply stabilized at the same time. A person's habit of sensing that informs their gendered feelings may change, whether in a manner of finding out more about themselves or in a manner of having a better framework to facilitate a more comfortable style of oneself. And in fact, cisgender people and transgender people alike do often cultivate new habits of sensations, with or without change to bodily organs and aesthetics in order to feel better. And they do form different relations with their bodies as we go through life. So instead of worrying that the concept of habit will make genders unstable or inconsistent, we must ask, how do social norms function in such a way that it allows, naturalizes, and applauds some habitual sensations and habit-forming techniques and pathologizes some others? What constitutes and what enforces the combination of habits that is the cisgender body that we know of? Thank you.
So we have 20 minutes. So who's got a question?
No, so this one's going to be very quick, but sort of pursuant to a lot of other reading I've been doing. You're talking about the sensation of the underarm hair. Would you call that gender dysphoria?
No.
Why not?
Because it's not incongruent to. Do you mean that as a cisgender
feeling as a
person?
cisgender person having underarm hair and feeling that that's not what it's supposed to be? Would you call that sensation gender dysphoria?
No, I would not, but that's because I also think that it is very mundane, and then the technique of managing it is very readily available, and then the sensation is not as incongruent as it is utterly distracting, and but I see where the question is from, and it's also part of the project is to problematize the cisgender body, right? So I don't want to say, no, as a cisgender woman, my body is completely unproblematic. Right, so I totally see where the question's from. I wouldn't, because gender dysphoria is such a specific term with its connotations, but no, I do not think of the body as just utterly natural or correct or anything. Yeah.
Okay.
Thanks for the question. Yeah.
So maybe to piggyback off of the first question that was asked, hi Chris, by the way, good to see you. We've been at some conferences. So I love the presentation. I was actually just sort of trying to put my finger on, I see the project you're engaging in as being sort of looking for a unified theory. And I love that, because I know you're someone that starts from more of a psychoanalytic viewpoint, and I'm someone that starts from more of like a cognitive neuroscience standpoint. And I love that we're working towards the same place. You used this word topography a lot. It made me think that maybe a good way of conceptualizing the sort of the difference between the what Elliot Page is talking about versus what you're describing vis-a-vis shaving your armpits. It's sort of like the difference between topography and geology. In other words, that there is a hard bedrock, there is like literally the shape of the Earth's crust that is, it's a simple, very simple basic shape, but it's pretty rigid. And then there is everything that gets layered on top of that by circumstance and events and, the animal life, plant life, the wind, the rain, all that. And so it's the same thing with bodily sensation, that we begin, as you were talking about, doing such a great job giving a synopsis of contemporary neuroscience and inactive bodily cognition. That it's a process of feedback loops to help us facilitate intentional decision making as conscious beings. And so we have an internal map of the body, but then we also have so much that gets layered on top of that and inflects on those experiences as well. So I guess to the prior question, I just wanted to say it's not really an either or thing. It's just a difference of like, one sensation being on just a very basic, crude level of bodily integrity in a physical sense versus everything else that gets layered on top of that psychosocially and culturally.
Thank you, that's perfect.
Thank you so much, Chris. Great presentation.
Thank you, Genji.
Do you want to repeat it, or do you want me to repeat it? It was a lot, but let me see if I can. So I think the basic idea here is just for if people were having a hard time hearing it, was that what Chris is trying to do is to kind of get a unified theory of that allows to think about both dysphoric phenomena and sort of less dysphoric phenomena within a single space. And what the questioner is sort of suggesting is that you can kind of map that onto the topography geology kind of model and think about some very basic structures at the level of geology, and then the idea that much of what gets counted as topography is stuff that gets layered on top of that in various ways by various other kinds of processes. And so part of the stakes, to come back to Whitney's question, might be, or part of the way to think about, what is the difference between a moment of, okay, I forgot to do a little maintenance ritual, that fits, and I feel something odd about that, but it doesn't kind of rise to anything like the level of a dysphoric kind of sort of sensation. It is a little uncomfortable or a little awkward. Might be that what's happening is a phenomenon at different levels of this kind of sedimentation and habituation process. I think that's reasonably adequate. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. So
and Genji suggests that the body can be understood. There's a very fundamental level of body integrity that can be understood as the bedrock, right, to follow the topography and geology metaphor.
Is that how you understand it? I don't want to mischaracterize your position.
I think so, but I also don't know what's the distinction between topography and geology. So I'll have to ask you more and do more research on that. I think it's definitely a metaphor that I've seen other people used as well, and especially about gendered body, the body as the bedrock. So I think there's, I think the distinction that you made between the body integrity versus all the psychosocial layers that are on the body, which shape the body as we see it and experience it and live it, is definitely a metaphor that I see a lot, and I'll explore more.
So with this like feedback loop that's going on, in which the brain is producing like this background radiation, I'll call it, of like a certain gender, and then is performing like a check with bodily sensation, and then normally for cisgender people they align, but for trans people they don't. How would you account for that like bedrock initial check, like what the brain is doing initially, constantly being shifting? Because I know that's a trans experience that I definitely run into a lot, where like gender is often described not in woman, man, non-binary, etc., but in my gender is a strawberry today, or my gender is I'm a hockey person. Like, would you account for those type of feelings, I guess?
So what I'm trying to avoid is to provide an explanation of how that forms, because I think the way that our each own individual experience with our gender and our body is ultimately very individual and unique. And then, so Genji also mentioned, a large part of my work, of my dissertation, is psychoanalysis. And what I take from that is there's a dark box of our individual formation that is not reducible to any one element. So what I'm trying to avoid is to give an explanation to how cisgender people or transgender people come to be how they are. What I'm trying to, and for that matter, I think, the way that people talk about genders, some people say, oh, my gender is a sad boy, right? Right, so like there are ways in which that a sad boy very often is in, it's a term that people online use to talk about depression and other mental illnesses, right? So there are ways in which that we experience our body that is also so much formed by our individual personal history that is not reducible to any one element or biological feature or experience or so on and so forth. So, so I think, yeah, the thing that you point to is the thing that I'm trying to avoid giving an explanation to, if that makes sense. Yeah.
Okay, so this brain disconnect or expectations not aligning, do you think this theoretical mechanism can be used to other aspects of the human being? I'm thinking of anorexia. Okay, so you follow where I'm going with this. So do you think it's a valid kind of theoretical way of looking at many aspects of the disconnect? Or is this unique for the gender situation?
So S.J. Langer, who developed this model, he works on, so he has two specializations. One is gender dysphoria, one is trauma. So he uses this model to explain also people who have experienced trauma, and which also significantly changes the way that they relate to their bodies. So I myself, I don't practice clinically, so I can't say for sure, but I definitely see potentials for a feminist phenomenological account of other type of body dysphoria, so anorexia or other type of dysphoria. So I definitely see a potential, but I think more research, more clinical research will need to be done for that.
Thank you so much for this talk. I'm thinking about what you said, something like cis people don't feel their gender, and I don't know if I'm just like projecting, but it seems to me that like cis people have huge anxieties about gender performance and work really hard to conform. And I'm just wondering, you know, in your discussion of habit and dealing with free energy, when people who experience that sort of non-alignment are trying to manage that free energy and like channel it into something, is that a reproduction of habits generated by social cues, or is it an expansion of habit? I'm just thinking about, yeah. Does that question make sense?
Can you say a little bit more about reproduction versus expansion?
Is it just, in the last part of your paper, you talked about habit as socially situated, but also a discussion of habit as sort of like reshaping of your body's relationship in the world. I'm really bad on Merleau-Ponty, by the way. So there's a lot of stuff I don't understand, so I'm trying my best. But is it reproducing what's already there socially and taking up cues that are already there? Or is it a sort of like expansion that comes from the body that's a channeling of that free energy into an expansion of a way of being in the world?
Wait a minute, I'm writing notes. So whether taking up a habit is to reproduce the social environment that afford that habit, or is it an expansion of my being into the world? I think that's so a part that I skipped is another phenomenologist, Edward Casey, talking about Merleau-Ponty's notion of habit, and he says that habit is precisely the middle ground. Habit is the middle ground of expanding my body into the world and organizing the world as it is around me right now through this body's tasks. So for example, driving is at the same time expanding my body to a new way of moving, a new whole set of things to do, a whole set of ways to perceive cars, lights, stop signs. But also it is, we do reproduce what is available. We drive the cars that are available on the market, and then we go according to the traffic rules that do exist already in our society, and so on and so forth. And to your first question, whether cisgender people feel or don't feel their gender. So cisgender people don't feel their gender. That's Langer's argument there. And I think I think Langer will want to make the distinction between, as a cisgender woman, I don't feel that my skin is smooth, or my joint has greater mobility, right? I don't feel my joint mobility. It's a thing that I don't feel. And then Langer would say that a trans person feels all of these things, or maybe not all of these things, a variety of these things that are so disrupting that make their daily lives difficult. But so I think he definitely wants to make that distinction, but I also see what you mean, that cisgender people have a lot of gender anxiety, right? So there's a lot of, if my voice is too low or too high, or if my body hair is too much or too little. And recently I've seen this, there's a Vice article on a lot of rich men taking the pandemic to disappear to have a leg lengthening surgery. Yes.
Wow.
Because it requires them to disappear from the world for 3 months to heal, because it's breaking bones and then adding things to the bones to lengthen. And then the comments are like, this is gender affirming surgery for cis people. Right, so I think a lot of people do have this notion of, oh, it's cisgender people, their gender also needs surgical affirmation, and how do we think about that? Or another set of question is, why is it that hormonal treatment for trans people are seen as so unnatural, but for cisgender people are seen as that's exactly what you needed. We have medicine now, please take medicine. Right? So I think there are definitely different ways of thinking about whether the leg lengthening surgery is a gender affirmation surgery, but I think it opens up a set of very interesting questions of regulation and policing and where we draw the line of what is acceptable medical intervention and what is grotesque or pathological. Yeah.
So I would like to thank everyone in the online audience and all of you for coming, and I'd like to ask you to help me thank Professor Ma.
Thank you. Thank you all.